Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining me. My name is John Fellas from Scottish Charity Regulator Oscar. I'd like to welcome you to this event hosted in partnership with the Cyber Scotland Partnership as part of the Charity Fraud Awareness Week. I'm going to hand over to the experts to run the session, and Alison will do that before we have a main presentation and some questions at the end. Just to remind everyone at the very start of the call that this event is being recorded so that we can host it on our website and allow people who weren't able to attend at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon to watch it at their leisure. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Alison Stone, the Third Sector Cyber Resilience Coordinator, who's based at the Business Resilience Centre as part of Cyber Scotland. Alison is the Cyber Resilience Coordinator for the Third Sector, extensive experience in helping charities and volunteer organisations improve their cyber security. She offers training and awareness sessions in a range of cyber-related subjects and is happy to support and work with any third sector organisation as you embark on your journey to making your staff and systems more secure and resilient. So, Alison, take it away.
Thank you, John. You would have thought that I'd have written that for you. It sounded very like something I would have written. Right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us, as John says, a dreary Tuesday afternoon. Delighted to be hosting this session with some big hitters, actually. Dave Carter from British Council here joining us for Charity Fraud Awareness Week. He is the meat in the glamour sandwich that John and I are. So I'm just going to do a little bit of an introduction to both of them, and then I'm going to hand over to Dave, who you're really actually here to listen to, not John and myself. The format for the day is Dave will give us a really comprehensive presentation about stuff that charities need to know. We've got some questions that have been submitted in advance, so we'll have a chance to ask those towards the end, and also anybody who wants to ask a question as we go along, pop it in the chat box, or we will open the floor at the end of the session and we can just have an open discussion. Now, I'm going to give you a little bit of a bio of both of our chaps today. Dave has been head of counter fraud for 2 major international charities, including his current role at the British Council. He was recruited there to design, build, and then run the global counter fraud functions. In both organisations, Dave has had global responsibility for fraud and crime management, including awareness raising, reporting, detecting, responding, and prevention. He's definitely a big hitter, and we're delighted to have him here today. The majority of Dave's career has been spent with the City of London Police, where he served for 14 years, rising to the rank of Detective Chief Inspector. Most of this time was spent as a detective investigating serious and major crime, including homicide. Dave is chair of the Charity Commission's Charities Against Fraud Group and a special advisor to the Fraud Awareness Panel, and therefore has got a really good insight into Charity Fraud Awareness Week. I'd also like to introduce John Fellows. John is a senior manager for digital and communications for Oscar, the charity regulator, and he's leading on the management of Oscar's own digital infrastructure and their internal and external communications. He's got 2 decades of public communications in the Fed sector, politics and public sector. I think we're lucky to have both of those for our entertainment this afternoon. So without further ado and much more from me, I'm going to hand you over to Dave. Dave, take it away.
Thank you, Alison. I shall try very hard to live up to that lofty introduction. I appreciate that very much. And can I just say thank you to you all for joining this session. Often one of the first steps on the road to successful management of fraud and cyber within an organisation is the acceptance that it is a problem. So you've clearly passed that first test because you are here right now. So I'm just going to try and share my screen with you, which seems to be a slight problem because I can't find the right presentation. So whilst I struggle to find the right slide, which I prepared in advance and is now hidden itself. Here it is. There we go. If I can just check that you can all see that, please.
It's not quite full screen yet, Dave.
There we go.
So, Dave.
Perfect. Thank you.
Perfect. Right. Okay. Thank you very much. So as Alison has pointed out, I am the head of fraud for the British Council. Before that, Save the Children International, and before that I was in law enforcement dealing with sort of international organised crime gangs impacting on fraud within the United Kingdom. So I've worked within the sector for about sort of 8 years now, having left the police. And in those 8 years, I've seen a significant shift in the way that fraud and cyber is managed, and it has moved forward beyond all recognition of what it was like. Obviously, there's Charity Fraud Awareness Week this week, which I'm sure you're all aware of, and that is the driving force, if you like, of these changes. But awareness raising within charities of these sorts of issues is absolutely sort of paramount. You can't start to tackle a problem that you don't recognise and you don't see. So it's all a matter of widening the fraud landscape and letting people know that fraud is nothing to be particularly scared of. It's not a dirty word, it's not the F word, it's just something that needs to be managed as you would manage any other business risk. And by keeping it simple and introducing some fairly straightforward measures would make that much more straightforward for all of you. So I'm not gonna read off the slide. The main point of this session, we have only got sort of 45 minutes, and we will be we're already 7 minutes into that, and then I will try and allow some time for Q&A at the time, but I do have a tendency for overrunning slightly, so I'll try and keep myself in check. But the main reason for this session is to try and identify what fraud is, what you can do to spot it, and also what you can do to stop it. And we also talk a little bit about why is fraud important? Why should people care about fraud? Surely this isn't something that would happen to me or my organisation. This is only something that happens to other people. And my not-for-profit organisation is a good organisation, nice organisation, doing good things, and we don't have to worry about fraud. It's other people's problems. And I'm hoping that this will be something that this session will make you realise that that is not the case at all. And obviously the fact that you're here in itself is a first step to the acceptance that fraud is a problem which unfortunately faces us all, but it can be resolved fairly simply with introducing a few straightforward measures. So first up here is what actually is fraud. Fraud is not some great mystery. Yes, there is a legal definition of fraud. Do you need to worry too much about that? Not as far as I'm concerned. I would certainly not be too worried about whether what you're dealing with matches the legal definition and the points to prove for a fraud, or whether it is a more widespread or wide-scale sort of financial crime type situation. But first, just to sort of tick that off, what is a fraud? This is pretty much the most straightforward definition of fraud that I can find. There's 3 elements to it, really. So 3 points to prove from a legal perspective. There has to be a deception. You can't commit fraud without there being some form of deceit. There has to be intent. It has to be an intention. So that word intended, it has to be there. You can't commit fraud by accident. There has to be some form of intention to deceive. And there has to be at least an attempt for some personal loss or gain. And the loss or gain could be financial, could be reputational, it could be a variety of different things. But that's kind of the broadest definition of fraud. All I would suggest is not to worry too much about that. If you remember one thing about what fraud is, it's basically theft with a lie. So if you can remember that, you're not going to be too far off the truth. There has to be some form of a deceit. But so we, in the world of sort of fraud management, we end up dealing with a lot more than just fraud. And there are some of the examples of the sorts of things we deal with here. So I have opened my chat box. So if anybody wants to ask anything specific about any of those cases, about what they are, if they're terms you don't understand, then please do feel free to write it in the chat box and I will try and answer it. My point for this slide is that the landscape or the piece of things we deal with is far wider than just fraud, even if it's just a simple theft. Excuse me. So theft is not a fraud. Theft is, dishonestly taking people's property and keeping it. That's a simple definition of theft. There's no deception in there. So you add a deception to that and it becomes a fraud. You add being a trespasser in a building or otherwise to that, and it's a burglary. You add threat of violence to that, and it's a robbery. All of these sorts of things are all cases that cross my desk, not infrequently. So not everything is a fraud. A couple of things to note of particular relevance. One is the bribery. So you've got kickbacks, which is effectively commission from suppliers, for example. I've just seen the note on skimming. I'll come to that in a second, Francis. So you've got kickbacks, which is effectively commission paid to you for maybe a procurement contract that you've not been, that's not an official commission. And the kickback doesn't have to be money. It could be a meal out. It could be a holiday. It could be all sorts of different things. It's often money. But that you've also got facilitation payments, which is effectively paying of a small fee, usually to an official, for them to do something that they should do as a matter of course. The classic one is sort of paying someone to get through. They demand a payment from you to go through customs or something similar. So the reason I particularly pick on bribery is because we've got the Bribery Act, which covers the United Kingdom, all British legal entities, wherever they are in the country. So that could be Scotland, it could be throughout the UK, or it could be anywhere in the globe, if any of you work internationally. So the main thing to take away with that is there is a legal requirement to raise awareness of the risk of bribery within your organisation. There's a corporate responsibility, so that if a member of your staff or whomever gets involved in some form of kickback or facilitation payment, you as an organisation have informed that that is not acceptable and that is a criminal offence not to do that. And terrorist financing is a similar one. Again, that is one of the very few UK laws that is affects all of British legal entities wherever they may well be in the world. Excuse me, the fact they are not, it is not permitted knowingly or unknowingly to fund terrorism. And also unusually, there is a positive reporting requirement. So failing to report instances of terrorist financing is actually a criminal offence in itself. So there's been a particular question here around skimming. So skimming in this context is taking a small amount of money off the top of a payment, hoping that nobody notices. So let's say you're banking several £100s from a fundraising event, and £10 of that finds its way into the pocket of the person putting it in the bank. They hope that that £10 will not be missed, and therefore it's skimming like the cream off the top of the milk. It's just taking a little bit, hoping that no one's going to notice. I'll talk about embezzlement. Embezzlement is kind of a theft or a fraud, but when it's from a position of trust. So if you have been entrusted to look after, say, the finances of an organisation, and you steal that money, then that is not a simple theft. It is embezzlement, because not only is it, excuse me, not only is it the theft of the money, it's actually the abuse of the trust as well. And the one that people always ask about is arson. I mean, how can arson be considered a financial crime? Arson, as I'm sure you all know, is criminal damage by fire. Now, you will be surprised, I would guess, about how many instances of arson we get reported, because if there is a fraud investigation about to take place, or if there is a audit about to happen, I've dealt with a number of instances where there's been a mysterious electrical fire and all the documentation in relation to it has unfortunately disappeared or been burnt, and the evidence has gone. So we can't, and also arson could also be some form of an insurance scam. So we do see all of these sorts of things on a fairly regular basis. The point here is that we deal with far more than fraud, but I wouldn't worry too much about what legal definition it falls into. If it feels wrong, it's something that you need to be looking into, and we'll talk more about that sort of a bit later on. So I'm just going to do a quick quiz, which normally I've run this training sort of face to face. Obviously, it's slightly different in these modern times. So we'll try and do our best online. So I'm going to ask a series of questions. I think from memory there's 6 or 7, so not too onerous. And as I mentioned earlier on, I'm looking at the chat box. If anybody would like to hazard a guess, and there's no, doesn't matter if they're right or wrong answers. It's all basically looking for a figure. So first 2 questions are amounts of money. All the rest are an approximate percentage that you think is going to happen. But I really would welcome if anybody could open their chat box now and try and answer the question, because I'll be very interested in your responses. So the first question is, what are the estimated annual losses to fraud overall throughout the United Kingdom? So what I'm looking for here is a monetary value. You know, is it millions or is it billions? A sum of money that you think is lost to fraud throughout the UK. And it is, I'm getting loads of answers. That's brilliant. Thank you so much for all your responses. This is not specific to the charity sector. I'll give you a clue. That'll be the next question. But this is how much is lost to fraud across the United Kingdom annually. And there's some, lots of figures in the billions, which is where we need to be. None of you have got, well, one of you have just got about half the amount. Is 190 billion pounds. So the point of this is fraud is big business. A lot of money is lost from the economy into fraud. A lot of money is being made by people that they shouldn't be making. So the fraud sector, if you like, if I can call it that, within the UK is 190 billion. But how does that equate into the charity sector? So the same question, but this time, how much money do you think is lost to UK charities every year? So again, are we thinking millions? Are we thinking billions? What is the annual losses to UK charities? So again, some good answers there. A lot of them are very, very close. The answer is 2.3 billion pounds. So I don't know whether that's a shock to you or not. I think it certainly is to me. That's a staggering sum of money. That's 23 billion pounds that is taken out of the charity sector from where it is needed, from the people that are trying to do goodwill with this work, this money, and it's been taken from them and stolen and used for other purposes, not that it's intended for. And that is a truly staggering sum of money, which leads on to the next question. So all the next few questions are all, I'm looking for a percentage. So if we now know that approximately 2.3 billion pounds is lost in the charity sector every year, what is that as a percentage of the total revenue of the charity sector? And we can work that out, that if you're a not-for-profit organisation, what percentage should you expect to lose from fraud every year? So there's a few figures coming up around the sort of 5, 10%, 8% mark here, which are all pretty good. So the correct figure is about 5%. So I think the actual figure is 5.4. Now, how they can work this out, I really don't know, but some far cleverer people than me have worked it all out. There's various academic studies that have been done by a variety of different universities working with sort of counter-fraud associations, and this is where these figures have come from. It's not just Dave Carter making this stuff up. These come from academic studies. So 5% may be a bit of a surprise to you that that there would be so much of a percentage. The question you're asking yourself now, I would guess, is that, well, I don't see 5% of my organisation's revenues being lost to fraud. In fact, I don't see 1%. I see 0%. So why is that? Well, that brings us neatly onto the next question, which is, what is an estimated percentage of charity fraud that's actually reported and detected? So what I mean by that is that within every organisation, despite the fact that you will have a zero tolerance appetite for fraud, that's the industry standard, everybody says that, but one thing fraud will never be is zero. So even in the least corrupt countries on earth, the Scandinavian countries, New Zealand, where crime and corruption is very, very, very low on a global scale, is there still crime? Is there still thefts? Are there still fraud? Yes, there absolutely are. So fraud is never going to be zero. The charity sector, sorry to be a myth buster, but people in the charity sector think that they are less likely to be victim of a fraud because they're doing good work. They're doing charitable objectives. They're doing good work. So who would commit fraud against them? And we'll come back to that in a second. The truth is the fact that the charity sector is more under risk of fraud than other sectors because it's seen as a weak target. It's seen as an organisation that doesn't have very robust control frameworks, doesn't have stringent compliance cultures, and because of that, it can be unnecessarily unfairly targeted, which actually makes fraud higher in the charity sector than pretty much any other. So back to this question. So what percentage of charity fraud is reported and detected? Some of you have actually got this absolutely bang on, which is 3%. So the important thing here is 3% of fraud is identified. So out of 100 cases of fraud going on in an organisation, I work for the British Council, who's a very large organisation by monetary value, the largest charity, I believe, in the UK. So, we report cases now over 100, I think 136 in a year was what we reported recently. And that's actually a positive because, look at who we are, what we do. Of course, we should be having figures of that sort of level. To think we only had, less than 100 cases a year would not be credible. It's about that credibility in the eyes of the regulator, in the eyes of the Cabinet Office, and in the eyes of the sector as a whole. So out of every 100 cases that take place, only 3 are identified. And so therefore 97 are not. So when we're looking at the landscape of fraud as we see them, we are seeing a very narrow slither. So what is going on over here in all the other different areas that is going on? That is where the problems are. And for those of you that thought, well, I don't see 5% of my revenue being lost to fraud, I see no percent. That's because your 5% is in the 97% of cases that aren't identified or reported. So my job as a counter-fraud person, dedicated resource working within one of the few charities in the UK that's actually has got one. And incidentally, the figure that had figures of numbers of charities out of the 170,000 plus not-for-profit organisations in the UK, those that actually have a dedicated resource like me, up until only recently was in single figures. I'm very pleased to say now that a lot more charities are coming on board, and that's now 20 or more out of the 170,000 charities have now got at least part-time dedicated role to deal with fraud as the threat is realised and the sector evolves towards being, realising the threats that it come in. So my job is to decrease the 5% to as low a figure as possible and increase the 3% to as high a figure as possible. So do I think that if an organisation has got a dedicated resource and has got an established counter-fraud strategy, do I think that their reported levels would be as low as 3%? No, I wouldn't. I would say 3% could easily go up to 30% if you've got a well-established practice. But these sorts of things by nature, there is deceit involved, as we've already heard. So these things will be going on under the margins. There's also a cultural reluctance to flag these things too early. 80% of cases that are reported have had previous red flags, and we'll talk about red flags more a little bit later on, but 80% of them could be stopped earlier. And if we look at the profile of someone who commits fraud, it goes up and down as their risk appetite changes over time. So we will find that that there's 97% of cases that aren't identified. Okay, so there's a question here, where are these figures sourced on? Again, there are some academic studies that are done where all of these figures have come from. I haven't made any of these up. There are, I think there's a particular study, which name escapes me at the moment, but it's the sort of estimated figure that fraud is lost to fraud within the not-for-profit sector that was done by a management consultancy company. They're the ones that have identified where these figures have come from. So next question, what is the estimated percentage of charity fraud committed by senior management? So as you're thinking about this, when this presentation is finished, then what I suggest you do is just go onto an internet search engine, put in charity fraud, and then click on news, and you'll see a whole stream of news articles where these sorts of incidents are happened. And it's often those people in more senior positions. I'm sorry to say this, but that is the truth. And why is that? That's because of the trust that is put into these organizations. So if you're in a position of trust, you can exploit that trust, and you're more likely to get away with things than arguably a more junior staff, which hopefully is being supervised more diligently. And that is evident by, as I said, just do a search for charity fraud and hit news, and you'll see article after article all relating to more senior management, trustees, etc. So the actual figure here is 24%. Now, as I said, I've not made these figures up. In my experience, 24% is quite a conservative view. I would suggest that the actual figures are higher than that, because it is that abuse of trust which is exploited, and there's more trust being given to more senior colleagues. So this is the last of the questions. So whilst you're thinking about this, I'll expand slightly on the question. So any organisation will have some fraud that is committed against it by their own staff, so internally, and there will be fraud committed externally by third parties, by external things here. So I suppose it's obviously this figure does not sort of include where you have sort of attempts at committing cyber crime, such as including phishing emails and the like. This is to do with sort of actual cases of fraud, as opposed to the whole widespread attempt by sending in sort of scams, etc. So is there anybody like to come up with of what percentage of case would you think would be committed internally? Okay, there's some figures coming in, and 30%, 15%, 30% again, 60%, 40%, really, they're all coming in now. Okay, so it's actually, I'm sorry to say, about 80%. Now, I will completely confess that this is the only statistic that is based on my own professional opinion, because it's what I see with my own eyes with cases that have been done. When I've worked for organisations in the past, and I've gone in there, they have almost all said to me, why do we even need a counter-fraud team? We're a nice organisation, we're doing good work. Who would commit fraud against us? Well, the answer is almost exclusively our own staff. Not completely exclusively, but often it is, because they are in this environment where they can exploit opportunities that are presented their way, and then they're given this opportunity. So we see this time and time again, and it's not just the organisations that I have worked for or with, it is across the sector. Somewhere between 70 to 80, if not higher, % of fraud is committed internally. So when we're looking at some of the things, the measures that we can introduce, we need to make sure that some of it is quite rightly centred on our own internal environment and culture of our own organisation. So I've moved away from those sort of quick run through of some questions. So just going to turn the chat off now so I can see the screen properly. Okay, so why should fraud matter to a charity? So I'm going to go through some of these just to sort of pull them out a little bit more. So financial loss is obviously one of them. Financial loss is important. You know, you're effectively spending other people's money. You work very hard to get your revenue, and it's very upsetting when any of that is lost. So financial loss is obviously a problem. I would argue that potentially the one next to it, damage to reputation, is even more damaging to the organisation than financial loss. I know how hard you work in order to maintain your reputation, and trust can be lost in a second if things go wrong. And there are a number, and I'm not going to sort of name and shame, but there are a number of very high profile organisations in the UK that have been victim of hugely reputationally damaging incidents in recent years, and in some cases more than one. So the problem that brings is almost insurmountable. So damage to reputation is hugely important here, and that, if anything, try and explains the culture why maybe fraud isn't managed as robustly as it should be within the charity sector, possibly because people are just too concerned to admit that it goes on. That, I'm pleased to say, is obviously a very antiquated way of thinking. It's sort of see no evil, hear no evil sort of approach. And I've seen in the last 8 years that there's been a big change away from that into a far more transparent process. Indeed, the British Council are, to my knowledge, the only charity in the UK that publishes annually a list of all the cases that we have annually that come in. So they're redacted. We don't go into detail on them. Certainly there's no personal information. And we sort of bring the information down to, you couldn't possibly identify who or where these things happen, but we do that. We do so for reasons of transparency, because what we're trying to say is, as opposed to trying to say we don't have a problem with fraud, what we're trying to say is we do have a problem with fraud. Look at who we are, look at what we do. It's ludicrous to think that we wouldn't have a problem with fraud, but as opposed to pretending that we don't, we're actually going to be doing something about it. And we should actually be very proud of the steps we've taken in the last 6 or 7 years to try and move us away from a culture where fraud was a dirty word into one where we actually have now got a positive anti-fraud culture throughout the organisation. And that is something that we are proud of. And the British Council has recently signed up to the Fraud Advisory Panel's Fraud Pledge, which no doubt has been been circulated around yourselves and you are aware of. I can absolutely guarantee you that not that many years ago, there is no way that we as an organisation would have signed up for that, because we would have been too concerned about the damage to our reputation. So it's only in recent years that we realise we've evolved culturally enough to realise that actually we are prepared to put our name to the fraud pledge, because we realise now that the benefits of doing that far outweigh any negatives to our culture or our reputation or our brand even of not doing so. The other one I'm just going to touch on recently, because I've talked about compliance with the law, I've talked about the Bribery Act, the Terrorism Act. There's obviously regulatory, charity regulatory requirements as well. That's important, as well as contractual requirements. But I'll just touch upon poor staff morale for a while, because that's one that I suppose I personally get affected by more, because I am the ones clearing up the mess that's been left behind. But regularly I've dealt with situations where the culture within a particular office or a particular team has been very bad, almost toxic. There's been poor staff morale, and it's mainly because 1 or 2 individuals are committing fraud. The rest of the staff know about it, and they don't know what to do about it. It makes their life very difficult. One of the behavioural red flags that we see time and time again on fraud is a controlling, confrontational, almost bullying management style, where people are effectively mistreated because the people committing fraud don't want to be challenged. And we see that time and time again. So as soon as someone says to us, we've got this circumstance has been reported, and you know, we'll say, well, have you spoken to the manager? What have they said? Oh, well, we don't like to talk to them because, you know, they're a bit shouty, and you know, they're not really engaging with us. As soon as we hear that, you know, all the alarm bells goes off, because that is the environment straight away that we realise that people are doing so to create this aura of fear around them, that no one will dare challenge them. And we see that a lot. That leads to poor staff morale. And when a devastating fraud has hit an office, a team, an organisation, it takes them a lot of time, aside from the financial loss, aside from the damage to reputation, it takes them such a long time to deal with the issues. The issue that they thought that somebody who was their colleague, their friend even, has all the time been betraying them, is a very difficult thing to manage. So that happens quite a lot. So I'm going to move on to why should this matter to individuals? Why should this matter to you? So I sort of don't apologise for this slide, because I think that the vast majority of people who commit fraud against charities, as we know, are generally the organisation's own staff. How many of those have joined the organisation with the intention of committing fraud against them? Very, very few. And they will do so because things have happened to them, maybe internally, maybe externally, which lead them into being somebody that's committed fraud. And we'll talk more about that on the next slide. But we have to make people realise that there are consequences to people's actions. We often talk about the zero tolerance to fraud policy. Well, that means nothing unless it's actually acted upon. And by doing the things on this slide mean that it is actually it is not a meaningless rhetorical statement. So far too often, and I have seen this is now moving in the right direction. I have seen that people are allowed to resign as opposed to facing up the consequences of their action. So we will always try and recommend that appropriate disciplinary action takes place, as opposed to just allowing people to shuffle off, resign, go and join an organisation with their reputations intact, and the cycle starts over and over again. We will, wherever possible, report people to the police. Now, reporting people to the police is a whole webinar in itself. In this country, we're fortunate or unfortunate enough to have action fraud, where these things can be reported fairly easily. I say slightly tentatively, but fairly easily. And you know, you have reported them to the police, which is kind of the most you can really do. There are places that we work around the world where reporting to the police is not an option for a whole variety of reasons. But the United Kingdom is generally one where we can. But you know, people realising that if they commit fraud, they may well be dismissed and not allowed to resign. They may well be able to face criminal prosecution via the police or the Crown Office, etc. That is going to be something that will deter people. And when we talk about the next slide, then that may become more relevant. Just before I do that, just one touch upon losses will be recovered. That's always a very difficult area, because you know, often we're taking money from people that have got money problems, so don't actually have anything to give us in the first place. Civil action can be very expensive and very time consuming and take a very long time. But in this, in the UK, we do have small claims court, which can be used and has been utilised in the not-for-profit sector a great deal. And you may well find that that is certainly something that's taken from. We also have, bearing in mind that a lot of the time staff are involved, funds can be recovered if legally permitted from their salaries. Okay, so I'm going to move on swiftly to why does fraud happen? So there's a thing called the fraud triangle, and I'm going to go on to explain this a little bit, spend a little bit of time over this, because this is, it is very simple, but it is really, really true. And if you want to prevent fraud from happening in your organisation, if you're aware of this model, then it does kind of explain things to you. As I mentioned earlier on, do people join an organisation with the intention of committing fraud on that organisation? The answer is very, very rarely. It does happen, but very, very rarely. Normally, they arrive in the organisation, they're there to do a job, and they commence doing it. Once they've been there for a while, they get themselves into a position where they may be in a senior role, they may be trusted by the amount of time they've been there. They get comfortable, and there they are. And then they come across an opportunity. Now, I'm not going to read off the slide, but in our various organisations, I'm fairly sure that all of us will see opportunities to commit fraud if we wanted to. Nobody works in a 100% control proof environment, and controls are enforced by human beings, and human beings are fallible. So therefore, there's always going to be opportunities. My job as head of fraud is to make sure those opportunities are reduced to an absolute minimum. Now, we could make there being no opportunities at all, which would effectively result in the organisation not being able to do its business. So it needs to have that flexibility in order to work. So if you reduced the opportunity for fraud down to zero, you may find it very difficult to operate. So there always has to be this kind of trade-off. So the first thing is opportunities. And many people, I'm sure almost everybody on this call, will have opportunity to commit fraud if they wanted to, but they just don't, because they're not that kind of person. But then you introduce pressure into their lives. Now, pressure could be a whole variety of different things. I've seen all of those pressures at play. Pressures change during people's lives. If people have worked for an organisation for 5-10 years, they go through different phases of their life. You know, could be single, could be married, could have a young family. You know, all sorts of things happen to people during the time that they're at work, and they get pressures on them. That pressure may impact on how they view these opportunities. And as I mentioned earlier on, people just don't turn out one day and go off and boom, commit fraud. They start off very gradually, and it may well be something that can be very easily explained as I've just sort of, pushed the boundaries of a compliance thing. I've just overclaimed slightly. It's been a mistake. All of these sorts of things. But then it will start to go up when they realise that if there's, let's say, ineffective line management, which is probably the singular biggest problem, then they will find that they can actually get away with this and no one's told them off. So therefore there will be more. They can get away with more and more and more. Then maybe they'll get a change of line manager, or a new trustee will come in who's really hot on compliance, and then it'll go down again. And then as the time goes by, maybe they relax and get more used to everything, then it starts to go up again. And it's this constant ebbing and flowing. But generally the risk appetite increases in time. And if you trace it all the way back to a single event where they started, that can usually be nipped in the bud by appropriate line management or supervision or another colleague intervening to stop them from doing it. And then we come into the third area, which is the sort of justification. I have had some very robust challenges by people who have said, well, I haven't committed fraud, I wouldn't do that. But actually, when you look at what they've done, they've met the definition. Or simple theft, for example, where you've taken something that didn't belong to you and you've kept it. That is theft. They don't want to think of themselves as that kind of person. So the intention to repay is something I've heard many, many times. I was going to pay back, but you've made no attempt to do that over a course of a long time until you've been caught. Now you're offering to pay it back. It doesn't work that way. So there's all sorts of different ways, but this is a really good, in my mind, example of how and why people do things, why people who would join an organisation would suddenly do this kind of activity. I've got a couple of slides, but I'm very conscious of time. So I'm going to leave this slide up whilst I take any questions that we have. Simply because I personally think this is arguably the most important slide out of all of them, because these are the very simple, straightforward measures that you could introduce in order to prevent or minimize fraud from happening in your organization. And just before I hand back to Alison to answer what questions there are, there's three main things, three mandatory requirements that any organization, large or small, should have as an absolute minimum. One would be an anti-fraud policy, because you need to be able to tell people that what they can't do, because there's defense in law, which is, I didn't know I couldn't do that. No one told me that wasn't mine and I couldn't take it. They could use that as defense. So if you've got a policy in place, that negates that defense. But they need to know about that policy. So there must be, so the second thing is you must have some form of fraud awareness training. Now that could be straightforward as a couple of slides on PowerPoint that you circulate around your staff, on an annual basis to say, please read this and email me back to confirm you have. Once you've done that, you've then got your policy, you've then informed them of it, and you've got a record of the fact that they've read it. So if something does happen, you can check your records and you've realized that they have been informed they couldn't do it. So it sort of negates that defense. So that's a really sort of important thing to make sure. The third thing is to have a response plan. A response plan can often be an appendix to the policy. If you look on the bottom right-hand corner of this slide, preventingcharityfraud.org.uk, that's a fraud advisory panel / charity commission sort of portal where you'll find a whole host of useful things, including template fraud awareness, fraud response plans, and also fraud policies. So the fraud response plan is if a fraud was happening to you tomorrow, what would you, and you knew that it was going to happen tomorrow, what would you want to do today in order to plan for it? Because you don't want to be dealing with a fraud in a crisis situation when it's happening and you get that lump in your stomach and you get that OMG moment and you're going, what do we do now? You want to plan for that in advance. And a fraud response plan can be 1 page. It just says, this is what you're going to do in these circumstances. And it just allows you, just makes you in order to deal with it if and when it happens in an effective way. So you must have a policy response plan and some fraud awareness training. So on that note, I will stop and I will sort of refer back to Alison for any questions.
Thank you, Dave. That was absolutely fascinating, a little bit scary, but yeah, just a brilliant summary of things that third sector organisations need to look out for. So thank you very much for coming along. Will the slides be available for people after the event?
Yeah, I'm happy to circulate them to you, Alison. If you wanted to send them out, that'd be fine.
Fab. There's a lot of interest in the fraud triangle, which I thought was particularly interesting. So that's brilliant. We do have a number of questions that have been submitted in advance. I'm going to kick off with one of these and maybe do a couple of these and then open the floor if that's okay with you guys.
Absolutely, yeah.
We've got a question about training and fraud awareness training. What's the best way to do that, as they've got quite a disparate staff that are working different hours and based in different places? Any suggestions of good resources that people could avail themselves on?
Absolutely. Can I just check you can hear me, Alison? Because I'm a bit concerned.
Yeah,
oh, good. Just my screen's frozen, so I can still keep blathering on. Okay, so fraud awareness training. As I said, it could be as crude as putting a couple of slides together yourself, or having a fraud awareness document that you get staff to sign, which is, here are some examples of fraud. Now, there are a number of training options. So I've worked with a number of organisations to write sort of like an e-learning package for them, which doesn't have to be expensive, but it's kind of like a 30 or 40 minute e-learning module that just ticks off all the main sort of statutory areas. So fraud awareness, bribery, corruption, terrorism financing, something on cyber related, something fundraising related, just so it kind of ticks off all of those boxes. 30 to 40 minutes, that's really all it sort of needs to be. But I know that some of the larger charities in the UK have their own proper branded up model. Some of the medium-sized charities may want to sort of buy an off-the-shelf thing that they can provide to their staff. But I'm also very conscious that 80–90% of organisations are very small. So for them, a couple of slides on PowerPoint should be sufficient in order to educate the other trustees that this is something that they need to take very importantly. But it's really important to keep a record of the fact that they've at least been shown it, so that you can prove later on down the line that they have been told that they can't embezzle all the funds of the organisation.
That's brilliant. So it doesn't need to be hugely complicated or sophisticated. You just
Simple
need
is the best.
eat that elephant chunk by chunk. Okay, that's cool. I've got a question here for John, actually, from an OSCR perspective, that was submitted in advance by Sandy. How many cases of apparent fraud has OSCR referred to the Crown Office? I mean, do you guys clipe on people?
Well, thanks for the question. Actually, we got the question before, and so Paula, who's also on the call, had tried to track down a number, and it's not actually a figure that we keep. As far as I can make it, I don't think, certainly over the last year, that OSCR has directly reported cases of fraud in charities to Police Scotland, but primarily because when we would expect a charity registered in Scotland, if it was the victim of a crime, a crime of fraud, to let us know through our notifiable events process. So if there's something significant that happens within your charity, it could affect the running of your charity or the reputation of your charity, we ask that registered charities let us know about that. And part of that process, we would expect, as the victim of a crime, the charities would have already reported that to Police Scotland when they came to us. So, in this case, I suppose it's not about us as a regulator referring charities to the police. It's about, I suppose, treating charities as victims in this. I mean, what we know and what we know from Dave's presentation is that fraud and cyber fraud are particularly underreported crimes, and they're particularly underreported incidents. And I think if we can adopt our view is that we adopt the view that charities should take reasonable precautions to prevent themselves from falling victim to crime, but it's not. We're not operating a blame culture or perpetuating that sort of environment. We would like as many charities as possible to go to the police and come to us and report these incidents, because then we can understand it better. We can collect better information, and that way we can feed that back into actionable information for charities in the wider sector. So to answer the question, we haven't done so. We haven't done this. We haven't gone to Police Scotland, but we would expect charities to do that as part of the reporting requirements that we put in place for your registration.
That's a really good answer, John, and that's actually very, very reassuring that you want to work with organisations that find themselves in this predicament. Thank you for that. Dave, coming back to you, there's one that's just popped up in the chat. What sort of top trending frauds should we be mindful of? I've seen quite a lot, because I was part of the team that wrote the Cyber Resilience Bulletin that started during the start of the pandemic, and we kind of tracked the frauds as they went along the pandemic. When we were short of PPE, there was PPE frauds all over the shop. You will have seen a lot yourself. What's your view on that?
I mean, obviously, there has been a huge increase in cyber-related fraud generally. That is something that is particularly relevant. We've seen an awfully large increase in procurement-related fraud. A lot of it is also to do with the fact that as the way that organisations operate, and there's far less face-to-face sort of interaction with working from home, for example. People haven't been sitting next to each other in the office, so those management structures, which are already stretched to breaking points in a lot of organisations, have just sort of gone off the scale. And as I mentioned in the presentation, and I make no apology for mentioning it again, is that the single area to prevent loads of fraud is that oversight by a third party. If you don't have a line manager relationship within your organisation, the fact that you've got segregation of duties, the fact that you've got people signing off on different things, you're not you don't have one person as who's in the control of all these different things. And Alison's touched upon COVID. I mean, that was a game changer in the world of fraud. I've been fortunate or unfortunate enough, depending on your view, to have dealt with fraud within a humanitarian context in various different issues that have gone on around the world, with sort of humanitarian issues across sort of Africa and wider. And the one thing that happens as a consequence of these situations, such as a pandemic, is fraud goes up through the roof. A lot of it is because of the fact that the organisation is so busy trying to deal with this over here that it completely takes its eye off this over here. And whenever these sort of situations happen, I'm sort of hopping up and down saying, this is the time for more compliance. We need an increasing, we don't need a dilution of controls. We need an increase of controls. Otherwise, things are going to spiral. And I could give you some really hair-raising examples of how things have gone badly wrong in these circumstances. And we spoke earlier on about fraud running at 5%. I with no word of a lie, I've seen that 50, 75, 90% losses to fraud because of the external context of the humanitarian thing that's going on at the time. So at times like COVID, fraud is going to exponentially rise. There's no doubt about it.
Okay, that's really interesting. We've possibly got time for one more question, or I might put you guys on the spot and ask you both to give me one gem of advice that you could share with our audience today, what they can do when they finish this webinar and go and make that first step to being more fraud resilient.
If you take okay, I'll go first, Alison, give John a bit of thinking time. Because I've talked about a few, which I'm not going to repeat because I've already said them once. But the singular most important thing that I think is that you need to have an acceptance that fraud is a genuine risk to your organisation. And when I say fraud, I include any cyber-enabled fraud as well with that. It really is going to happen to you. And the fact that you're here now on this call is really good testament to the fact of how serious you take it. But when this call ends and you go back to your sort of business, so please do think about this and work out to yourself now we've had this realization that this is going to be a problem, what are the measures that we can do about it? And we've already discussed a few of them, but it's just that acceptance, Alison, that fraud is a problem that will happen to not just everybody else, but it could happen to us as well.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dave. John, I put you on the spot. I'm sorry.
Oh, that's okay. No, I think it's a fair question. I mean, I think as a regulator of charities, our job is to make sure that charities act in accordance with their aims and that trustees of the charity act in the interests of the organisation. And so from a trustee perspective, what we would say is that, if you've been here and you want to address some of these issues, go and take a look at your processes and procedures within your organisation, right? And the sorts of things that you probably will already have in place, and make sure they're robust and fit for purpose. So what policies you have about the management of staff and the relationship with the board, so that the board has proper oversight of what's going on a day-to-day basis. What financial controls do you have in place in terms of managing your money and controlling the movement of money within the organisation? And in terms of cyber resilience, what do you have what's your use of digital tools, which are fantastic and could make a real positive difference to the work of a charity? But what do you use, and what policies do you have in place to ensure that when you work online or you store information online, that's as safe and secure as it can be? I think if you can do those basic things, work with staff, have financial oversight, and take a look at your digital policies and procedures. And this doesn't have to be complicated. I think that's all proportionate to the size of your organisation, I would say. If you can do those on on a routine and a regular basis, then you'll place yourself in good in a better place to be able to deal with this. And I've thought, because you've thought about it in advance. So that's the advice from me. But as always, we're always happy to, if you're working in your organisation and you think you have a particular challenge or problem, then let us know through the notifiable events process, and we'll work with you to make sure that that you're in the right place to be able to resolve the issue that you have, and to make sure that you've taken all reasonable precautions that it can't happen again.
Brilliant, thank you. That was a really, really good answer, particularly as I put you on the spot. It's been a really, really good session. I've thoroughly enjoyed it, been a little bit scared, but that's no bad thing, Dave. Thank you for that. It's been great having you here. The work that's been done for Charity Fraud Awareness Week is incredibly important. There's still opportunity, it's on a week to get involved with different events. I think we've put the links to the website in the chat. But yeah, in closing, thank everybody for coming along. Really insightful presentation. I hope everybody got something at least from it that they will go away, think about, do a little bit different. And thanks to both of our speakers, Dave and John, for sharing your knowledge. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you for coming, everyone.